Choose her over this family. The words hit the dining room like a fist through glass, and nobody moved. The February cold had settled deep into the bones of Hartwell, Alberta. The kind of cold that made the fields look like they'd been carved from pale stone and made men say things they couldn't take back. Thomas Briggs sat it standing at the head of his own table, his thick hand pressed flat against the wood, his face the color of old brick. He was looking at his son. But his son was looking at the door, where Nora had just been standing, before she walked back out into the dark. Declan Briggs was 29 years old and had spent most of those years doing what his father told him. He'd taken over the East Pasture management at 19. He'd sat through church on Sundays without complaint. He'd learned to ride before he could properly read. He had not, in all that time, once looked his father in the eye and said no. That night, he did. 3 months earlier, Nora Calloway had arrived in Hartwell the way most things arrived in small Alberta towns, without much ceremony and without anyone asking for her. She'd taken the lease on the old Fenwick property at the edge of the Briggs land, a narrow strip of pasture and a farmhouse that had been sitting empty for 2 winters. The Fenwick land wasn't much to speak of. 40 acres, a collapsing fence line on the north side, a well that worked half the time. What it had was a barn with good bones, and that was enough for Nora. She was 26. She'd come from Peace River, where she'd been working a thoroughbred operation for a family who'd sold out when the patriarch died. She had references that were better than her clothes, and she had a young daughter named Iris, 5 years old, who wore the same red rubber boots every day, regardless of weather, and asked questions constantly. Nora didn't explain herself when she arrived. She signed the lease, paid first and last, moved her things in with the help of a borrowed truck, and started work on the fence line the same afternoon. Hartwell noticed her the way small towns notice anything that doesn't fit the existing pattern. They noticed the truck with the Peace River plates. They noticed the child who had no father mentioned. They noticed that Nora worked her own fence posts instead of hiring it out, and that she was good at it, and that she didn't seem to care what they noticed. Declan first saw her on a Wednesday in November. He'd been checking the irrigation line that ran along the property border, and she was on the other side of the fence, crouched over a post she was resetting in half-frozen ground. She had her hair pulled back under a wool cap and mud on her jacket sleeves, and she was talking to Iris, who was sitting on an upturned bucket a few feet away, apparently providing commentary. He said good morning. She said it back. Iris asked him if his horse bit people. He said only if they deserved it. Iris considered this seriously and nodded. That was the whole conversation. But he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon in the particular way that meant something was starting, whether he was ready for it or not. The Briggs family had been in the Hartwell area for 3 generations. Thomas had inherited from his father, who had inherited from his. The land was substantial. Over 800 acres of mixed grazing and cropland, and Thomas ran it with the same precision and the same pride that had always defined the Briggs name in Carmangay County. He was not a cruel man. He was, however, a man who had decided long ago what things were supposed to look like, and who became uncomfortable when they didn't. His idea of what things were supposed to look like, as far as Declan was concerned, included a particular woman. Her name was Vivienne Aldred. Her family owned the adjacent property to the north, another 800 acres, and the Aldred-Briggs land merger had been discussed in one form or another for 15 years. Vivienne was polished and measured and perfectly pleasant, and she and Declan had dated, loosely, for about a year in their mid-20s before it faded out the way things fade when neither person is actually driving. There had been no fight. There had been no real passion either. It had simply run out of road. Thomas had never accepted this. In his mind, the Aldred arrangement was not finished. It was only delayed. When he began to hear, through the tight channels of small-town listening, that Declan had been seen talking to the woman on the Fenwick place, he let it go. When he heard that Declan had helped her re-hang the barn doors, he mentioned, briefly, that it wasn't Declan's concern. When he heard that Declan had driven her to Lethbridge to pick up a horse she purchased there, because her truck was in the shop, he sat down at the kitchen table and waited for his son to come home. That conversation had been quiet, the kind of quiet that is more serious than shouting. Declan had not set out to fall in love with anyone. That was the honest truth of it. He'd started helping Nora because the Fenwick property shared a border with theirs, and it was practical. And because there was a gap in the shared fence line that was technically his family's responsibility anyway. He kept helping because she was competent and straightforward, and didn't treat him the way women in Hartwell usually treated a Briggs, which was to say, with a certain careful quality that had always made him feel like a financial consideration rather than a person. Nora treated him like a man who knew how to fix a fence post, and not much more than that until he proved otherwise. He found that he liked it. He found that he wanted to prove otherwise. Iris had started calling him Deck by the third visit. She had informed him that her favorite color was orange, that her kindergarten teacher was named Mrs. Bellamy and was very strict about coloring inside the lines, and that their dog, a border collie named Stamp, had once eaten an entire plate of bacon without remorse. Declan had listened to all of this with complete attention. It had been a long time since anyone talked to him without an angle. By December, he was finding reasons to stop by the Fenwick place every few days. By Christmas, he had stopped needing reasons. He hadn't told his family. Not because he was ashamed, but because he wasn't sure yet what there was to tell, and because he knew what telling would cost. He found out he'd been wrong about the timing when Vivian Aldridge showed up at the Briggs house for dinner on a Thursday in January that Thomas had arranged without mentioning it to Declan until that same afternoon. Declan sat through the dinner. He was polite. He was not cruel to Vivian, who was not at fault in any of this, and who probably understood what was happening better than she let on. But when Thomas said, afterwards, with Vivian still in the next room, that it was time to stop wasting time on the wrong things, Declan had said Nora's name out loud for the first time in front of his family. The room changed when he said it. Thomas did not shout. That was not his style. What he did was lay out his position in the flat, declarative way of a man who had never had much practice at being told no. The Fenwick woman was a tenant on borderline land with no family, no connections, and a child with no father present. She had nothing to offer, and nothing to recommend her except that she was capable with horses, which was not, Thomas said, a basis for a life. Vivian Aldred was the logical choice, the sensible choice, the choice that made the whole picture make sense. Declan listened to all of this. Then he said that he wasn't a piece of the picture. He was a person. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he said that sentiment was fine when you were 20, and that at 29 Declan ought to understand that decisions had consequences that lasted longer than feelings. Declan said he did understand that. He said that was exactly why he wasn't going to make the wrong one. He left the house that night and drove to the Fenwick place. Nora was in the barn doing a late check on the mare she'd brought back from Lethbridge, who was close to foaling. The barn was warm in that particular animal way, smelling of hay and wood and something living. Iris was asleep in the house. He told her what had happened. He didn't dress it up. Nora listened with her arms crossed and her back against the stall door, her expression the careful, steady one she wore when she was thinking seriously about something. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. And she said that she wasn't going to be the reason he blew up his family. She said it simply, not as a test, not as the kind of thing women say when they mean the opposite. She meant it. He said that she wasn't the reason. That his family had been wanting to make him into someone else's future for a long time, and that he'd been letting them because it was easier, and that easier wasn't the same as right. She looked at him for a long time. Then the mare shifted in the stall behind her, and Nora turned to check on her, and when she turned back, something in her face had changed. She said quietly that Iris had started asking when he was coming back every time he left. He said he didn't want to stop coming back. That was the night things became real between them, not dramatic, not declared, just real, the way things become when two people stop pretending they don't know what's happening. Thomas found out before Declan told him. That was how things worked in Hartwell. The dinner in February was not something Declan had anticipated. He'd arrived home to find his father, his mother Margaret, his younger sister Dawn, and Vivian Aldred seated around the dining room table with a formality that made it clear this had been arranged, and that he was the subject of the arrangement. His mother was pale and quiet, the way she got when she knew something was going wrong and couldn't stop it. Vivian looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, which Declan respected. Dawn said nothing, but she watched him with an expression he recognized. She was waiting to see what he would do. Thomas said with that flat precision that he'd heard Declan had been making things official with the woman at the Fennec place, that he was bringing this to the table now, before it went any further, because some things needed to be corrected before they became permanent, that the altered arrangement was still viable, that Vivienne had been patient, that the family name and the land and everything they built across 3 generations deserved better than to be handed off to a tenant farmer and a child with no provenance. Nora had knocked on the door in the middle of this. She'd come because she'd needed to speak to Declan about the foaling. The mayor had started, and he'd asked to be there. She hadn't known about the dinner. She was standing in the doorway in her work jacket with her hair loose and mud still on her boots, and she had heard enough of what Thomas was saying to understand the shape of it. The table went silent. Thomas looked at her the way he looked at things that had arrived in the wrong place. Nora looked back at him. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look angry either. She looked like someone who had decided, somewhere in the walk from the barn to the door, that she was not going to be made small in front of this man. She said directly to Thomas that she hadn't come to the house to cause trouble and that she was sorry for interrupting. That she only needed a minute of Declan's time. Thomas said that she had come at a bad moment and that it would be better if she waited outside. She said, and her voice was very level, that she'd spent most of her life waiting outside of things that concerned her, and that she was done with that particular habit. The room held its breath. Thomas said, and his voice had gone to that cold place it went when he was genuinely angry, that she was a guest in this county, and that she should remember what that meant. Nora said that she wasn't a guest. She was a leaseholder. She paid her bills, and she worked her land, and she raised her daughter, and she had never once asked the Briggs family for anything. She said that she understood Thomas had ideas about what his son's life should look like. She said she also understood those ideas had nothing to do with what Declan actually wanted, and that a man who couldn't see the difference between his own plans and his son's happiness had a problem that had nothing to do with her. No one spoke. Thomas turned to Declan and said, very quietly, that if he walked out that door with her, that was his choice, and he should be clear about what he was choosing. Declan looked at his father for a long moment. Then he looked at his mother, who was looking at her hands, and at Dawn, who was looking at him with something that might have been pride, and at Vivienne, who gave him the smallest nod he'd ever seen, the nod of someone releasing something they'd been holding for too long. He stood up. He said for the last time tonight, and clearly, that he was not choosing against his family, he was choosing his own life, that those two things were not the same, and if his father couldn't see that, then his father was going to have to sit with that for a while. He walked to the door. He touched Nora briefly on the arm, just briefly, and she looked up at him, and they went back out into the cold together, toward the barn where the mare was foaling, and something new was beginning. The foal was born at midnight. It was a bay filly, with a crooked white stripe down her nose and legs, that seemed too long for the rest of her, and she stood up on the 3rd try with the determined, slightly outraged expression common to young creatures who have just discovered the world is colder than expected. Iris had woken up and come to the barn in her pajamas and her red rubber boots, and she stood at the stall door with her hands gripping the wood and her eyes wide in the specific way of children witnessing something they will remember for the rest of their lives. She whispered to Declan that the foal looked like she was mad about being born. He said some of the best ones were. Spring came slowly to that part of Alberta, the way it always did, in fits, with setbacks, 3 warm days and then another frost, the fields going green and then gray and then green again. Declan moved his things to the Fennequit place in April, not dramatically. He packed what was his and he went. Thomas did not speak to him for 6 weeks. That 6 weeks was the longest and the quietest of Declan's life, and he was not going to pretend it wasn't hard. There were mornings he woke up before dawn and lay in the unfamiliar room, listening to the particular sounds of a different house, and wondered if he'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. But he'd get up, and Stamp the Border Collie would be asleep across the doorway, and from down the hall he could hear Iris insisting, at full volume, that she needed her orange juice before anything else in the world could happen, and Nora's voice, low and patient and slightly exasperated, telling her that orange juice did not take priority over putting on pants, and the wondering would settle into something that wasn't wondering at all. Margaret came to the Fennec place on a Thursday in May. She brought a tin of shortbread that she'd made with a recipe that had been in her family since her grandmother, and she sat at Nora's kitchen table for 2 hours drinking tea. She didn't say anything about Thomas. She asked about the foal. She asked Iris about kindergarten and got a detailed report on the injustices of Mrs. Bellamy's coloring policy. When she left, she held Nora's hand for a moment longer than was required. Dawn came the following week, and she brought nothing except herself and a directness that Declan recognized as the family trait he'd always liked most about her. She told Nora, in the blunt way of someone who has decided to skip the preamble, that she thought their father was wrong and that she was glad Declan had stopped waiting for permission to live his life. She stayed for dinner and helped Iris build a block tower of considerable ambition and very little structural integrity, and when it fell, they both laughed so hard that Stamp woke up from the far side of the room and looked at them with concerned bewilderment. Thomas came in June. He didn't call first. He pulled his truck into the yard on a Sunday afternoon when Declan was replacing boards on the north fence, and Nora was in the round pen working the young mare, and Iris was sitting on the fence watching with the attentive concentration she gave to things she considered important. Thomas stood at the fence for a long time watching Nora work. He watched the way she moved with the horse, the way the horse responded to her, the unhurried and confident economy of it. He was a man who understood horses. He had always understood them better than people. After a while, Iris looked over at him. She studied him with the direct and unselfconscious assessment of a 5-year-old. She said, "Are you Declan's dad?" Thomas said that he was. She said, "How come you haven't come before?" Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the round pen. Then he said, in a voice Declan had not heard from him in a very long time, uncertain, quiet, stripped of the flat authority, that he had made a mistake. He didn't say it to Declan. He said it to Iris, which was either the strangest or the most honest choice he could have made. Maybe both. Iris nodded in the same serious way she'd nodded at the question about the horse that first November morning. She said, "My mom says that's okay as long as you fix it." Nora had stopped the mare and was standing at the center of the pen, looking at Thomas over the fence. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the expression of a woman waiting to see whether a man was going to be what he claimed. Thomas looked at her. Then he looked at Declan. He said that the north fence had always been a problem on that side of the property line, that it was technically shared responsibility under the original land agreement, that if Declan was putting in new boards anyway, he might as well come out and do the section properly. It was not an apology. It was the closest Thomas Briggs knew how to come to one. Declan handed him a board. They worked the fence until the light went. Nora brought them coffee without being asked, and set it on the fence post, and walked back to the barn without making anything of it. Thomas drank it. He didn't make anything of it either. That was how it began. Not with a declaration, not with a resolution scene, not with the kind of clean moment that stories usually provide. Just two men working a fence in the long Alberta evening, and a coffee going cold on a post, and somewhere in the barn a bay filly with a crooked stripe standing in the clean hay, learning how to be in the world. The following spring, Declan asked Nora to marry him on a Tuesday morning in March, while they were both in the barn before the sun was up, because that was where most of the important things in their life had happened so far. She said yes before he'd finished the question, in the brisk and decisive way she had about things she'd already made up her mind about. Iris, who'd been listening from the hayloft, with an expertise at eavesdropping that neither of them had properly appreciated until that moment, leaned over the edge and said, "Finally." The bay filly, whose name was Tuesday by then, for no reason anyone could fully explain, lifted her head from the hay and regarded all of them with the permanent mild indignation that had been her defining characteristic since birth. Outside, the Alberta sky was just beginning to go that particular pale gold it goes before the sun clears the horizon, cold and clean and indifferent to the plans of people, but lit up all the same. I keep thinking about the moment Thomas Briggs stood at that fence in June, the man who'd spent 30 years deciding what everything was supposed to look like, and said, in a voice stripped of all that flat authority, that he had made a mistake. He didn't say it to his son. He said it to a 5-year-old in red rubber boots, which was either the most accidental or the most honest thing he'd ever done. That moment didn't happen because Thomas suddenly became a different person. It happened because of everything that came before it. Because Declan had stopped making the easier choice. Because Nora had walked through that dining room door and refused to be made small. Because Iris, who had no filter and no agenda, Just ask the question that cut through 30 years of pride in about 4 seconds. Causes and effects all the way down. Nothing in that story arrived without being earned. What I notice, when I sit with it, is that Declan's whole life up to that point had been shaped by a kind of inherited logic. Do what the family needs, keep the peace, let tomorrow become the same as yesterday. And that logic isn't malicious. It's actually practical. It works, right up until the moment it asks you to trade your real life for a tidy one. The honest move, the one that actually required something from him, was to see that clearly and act on it anyway. That's not easy. Most of us know what the right thing is long before we do it. The gap between knowing and doing, that's where character actually lives. Nora understood something that took Declan longer to learn. That self-respect isn't a reward you get after you've proven yourself to the right people. It's the foundation, not the finish line. She'd been outside enough rooms in her life to know that waiting for permission to belong was its own kind of slow disappearing act. When she stood in that doorway and said she was done with that particular habit, she wasn't performing courage. She was just finally done being afraid of a man's disapproval more than she was afraid of losing herself. And then there's Iris. 5 years old, in pajamas in the barn at midnight, watching a foal stand up for the first time on legs that didn't quite work yet, and saying it looked mad about being born. I think about that a lot. The best ones usually are, a little. The ones who figure it out aren't the ones who arrive gracefully. They're the ones who try again, and mean it, and don't stop. That filly stood up on the third try, not because the first two didn't hurt, because she didn't accept falling as the final answer. I don't know how to separate those three things from each other. Doing what's right when it's costly, thinking clearly when everyone around you is certain, and simply not stopping. They aren't three separate virtues to me. They're the same thing seen from different angles. And every story that's ever stayed with me, including this one, is really just a story about whether a person managed to hold all three of them at once when it mattered. The Alberta sky at the end of it all, going pale gold before the sun clears the horizon. Cold and indifferent and lit up anyway. That's about right.